Hi, I assume you've all set your watches on Coinsbank Standard Time. At any rate, I'm going to talk today about blockchain, Curie, Darwin, and email, which I think are four different concepts we should put together and perhaps get some evolution. You have two of my email addresses down there at the bottom. I know I have at least 8 or 9 more, because it's convenient to have a lot of email addresses. I suspect that everybody out there has at least 2 or 3, right? You have one for Gmail, and you use it for different purposes. And so, being able to have a lot of names is a key idea, and being able to create your own is the second part of that. So let's talk about that. First of all, why do I talk about Marie Curie? Well, I spent 8 years at the university named after her in Paris, but the real reason is she found this terrific force called radium or whatever, and got 2 Nobel Prizes, figured out the physics of radiation, and she killed herself for it. Basically, if you want, by the way, you can go look at her cookbook, but scholars that want to go handle her cookbook have to wear lead gloves because the cookbook is so radioactive. So the whole point is that when you have a very powerful concept, you have to make sure that you take care with the way you handle it. Now, I'm convinced of the power of the blockchain and the power of cryptocurrencies, but I think we have to be very modest and careful about how we enhance them and how we use them. But I think it's part of the future. My best expert, by the way, on security is little Steve Wonder, who said, when you believe in things you don't understand, then you suffer. And I think that should be a thing that will worry us when we're making extensions and making changes to social fabrics that we don't understand. Darwin, on evolution, what did he have to say? He said, those who collaborate and improvise have prevailed. We need to be able to think about technologies in this world that allow us to collaborate and improvise. A couple of theories on that. It applies to the internet as well, broadly speaking. And evolution is about prevailing, which may be cruel to some sacred cows out there. We have to figure out some of the concepts that we have to replace in order to get where we need to go. Survival imperatives are you have to be adaptable. You have to be powered by an expanding resource. What do I mean by that? The example that most people use is Moore's Law, where we know that physics gave us transistors and silicon and so forth, and people who figured out how to make the feature size smaller and smaller got more and more dense processors, more and more powerful, and the more and more powerful processors led to more and more powerful software to use them, and that's how we have the revolution that we have today in electronics. The same thing, I think, is true for the internet. We have to figure out how to be adaptable. We have the internet out there. How do we harness it to create a new desirable resource? There's fake internet history out there, a lot of it. One of the things that the internet history says is that the DNS was done by the IETF in 1983 for use on the ARPANET. Now, it may surprise you to believe that because the first IETF meeting was in 1986, 3 years after they claimed that they invented it. The other thing was that we shut the ARPANET off on January 1st of 1983, so it really wasn't, that's if you go out there, the history of how we got innovation and change isn't always correct. The real internet history, one aspect of it, hello? Doesn't work. Oh, okay. we had what was called the bang %@ meeting. And what we did there was that before there were many different email address standards and email systems. there are all these different formats. One set of people said you use a %sign. One said, well, you route email by going first to hop 1, then to hop 2, and you use exclamation points. Another one said, well, use the @ sign. And then people started combining both sets of standards so that, well, you sort of sent email from the edge of UUCP into CSNet by having a jump and embedding 2 different standards inside. The best example, or the worst example, depending upon your point of view, is this is a real email address from before we came along with user at domain in the DNS, and has a single routing system for email that's about user at domain. So where do we go with that, and why is that particular issue relevant? Well, we've heard today about how cryptocurrencies and blockchain are taking over the world, but from the standpoint of where the world is today, it's really pretty modest. If we take a look at, there's, according to some people, around 2.9 to 5.8 million active Bitcoin users. Okay, well that sounds like an awful lot until you compare that with the fact that there's 4.3 billion email accounts out there. My basic thesis to you is what we need to do is we need to figure out how to make cryptocurrencies and the counterparties, the party who's going to send and receive, give them identifiers such that we can scale up just like we scaled up email. Why is it that we can't send cryptocurrencies the same way we send email, or at least have you create as many account names as you want, have them in a global distributed system, and be able to make those payment transfers as widely. Right now, we're 1,000th of the size of the email community in the ability to do those transfers. We need to think about how to scale that. Another dimension of scaling is federation, which basically says we need we need to be able to make different systems interoperate correctly. The reason we have the term internet is it was a technology that would connect multiple networks and make them work as if it was one. We need the same sort of idea in the cryptocurrency world. So I guess the question we're asking here, is there some way to use the directory kind of technology that we had that would scale email in the internet systems and use it in the same way for federation and for exchange of cryptocurrencies or value? So I think the thesis here is that we need a directory, perhaps based on DNS or some extension of DNS. And by the way, this isn't just because I'm out here to sell you DNS, it's because the DNS has passed its peak decentralization. We know that it's the biggest decentralized system in the world, right? And we know that it's the biggest distributed system in the world. And every piece of electronics pretty much knows how to use it. Okay, so that's a bunch of real advantages. But the centralization of who controls the top level domains and the centralization of one of the deals that you may have heard of where the Mozilla people are going to direct all of your DNS traffic to Cloudflare. And they're going to do that to improve your security, supposedly. You know, you've heard about how 1111 is good for you and 8888 is good for you. There's these forces that are working on centralizing the DNS, which I don't think is a great idea. But one of the things that we might think about doing is not only bringing the directory idea to the crypto world, but bringing the decentralization ideas of the blockchain to the directory service. Keep track of the user's name in that directory. Keep track of arbitrary crypto keys and formats. Just like, for example, most of the activity that goes on in the DNS to deliver mail today has nothing to do with delivering the mail. It has to do with discarding spam and verifying that mail is not spam. And I believe that we end up with a system where something like the DNS acts as a cache to the ground truth that's stored in the blockchains. Where are we? We have an adoption curve for GUIs and DNS where basically there was exponential growth until you ran out of users just to serve as a source of demand. Today, in the blockchain cryptocurrency world, we're down here somewhere at the bottom of that S-curve. We need to figure out how to go mass market. And you've heard a lot of speakers say that we need governments to control it, and you've heard a lot of speakers say that you want to keep government control out of it. If what you want to do is you want to see cryptocurrencies grow in a sort of free environment, then I think getting mainstream adoption, if, for example, 200 million people in the US wanted to have cryptocurrencies and believed in it and it was wonderful, the government would still try and say no, but the people would probably push back and we would end up with a better solution. So I think that getting mass adoptions is one of the keys to advancing that agenda. One of the things we have to be mindful of is when we do this, you have to figure out how to get people to actually put their information into whatever the directory system is you're going to use. And basically people maintain that data if and only if it gives them value. For many years in the early history of the internet, there were all of the academic experts who said that there was an obviously required internet directory and the DNS was a bad idea because it wasn't really a phone book that kept track of people's information. And the DNS wasn't used to keep track of all people's information. But the academics who created many instances of that directory never got one that people would use. So who was, I think, the really successful party who invented the internet directory? I think it was Facebook. And Facebook basically said, hey, put your data in here and we'll get you dates. And we'll also let you publish to all of your friends and stroke your ego. That was the incentive. There had to be value that's delivered. So what I'm saying here is that if we think about DNS or some other directory system that we want to use to give users all the names they need to name the parties that are going to receive their transactions, the financial would be the lever that would allow us to kind of do that and convince people to put their data in this system. How would we do this? Well, good artists copy and great artists steal. I think features from the DNS world that we could use would be multi-level delegation, in the sense that in order to create identities, you want to be able to say, hey, for coinweb.io, we have somebody who can create sales. We have somebody that can create multiple receiving account numbers or whatever. We need to be able to distribute that authority, because you don't all want to maintain it in a centralized account, and you don't always want to have everybody doing their individual private key. You want to be able to outsource the operation. Again, the DNS talks to any computer in the world and has an implementation for it. I think the ground truth should still be on blockchain. And the other thing that we know is how to create identifiers for people with foreign names. Most domain names these days are not in the Roman alphabet. They're in Chinese or Arabic or Japanese or whatever, taken in a toto. All right, what are the features that we want to combine from the distributed ledger world or the blockchain world? Security that's faced some real assaults. We have had our security issues over in the DNS side, but obviously money is the thing that really attracts security assaults, and people have already thought of it as money, so great. We combine the two.
Yes.
Where does the complexity come from? You might say, well, gee, why do I have to add this other thing into my system? Well, we always add complexity to try and defeat the people who are attacking us or trying to defeat what we're doing. So it's a competition, and we can handle the complexity because of the new power that we're getting out of our increased capability in terms of processing power, memory, bandwidth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What are the DNS sacred cows that we need to gore in order to move forward? Well, I think, the IETF and ICANN want to control our future totally. I was the chair of the IETF, so, don't tell anybody I said this. But, one of the questions is the model of control where there's one digital key that controls all of the DNS. And oh, by the way, they're changing it in October, so there might be some fun the day after they change it. And all the DNS experts of the world are at one meeting in, I think, Amsterdam that day. That was what I thought was great planning. So that they need to get home in order to fix something, well, gee, it's not going to work. So I think what we need is, we need a separable namespace. And what do I mean by that? I'd like to have a namespace that works with the DNS namespace, which is the basis of our email and other, web and so forth access. But one where if regulation from ICANN comes from push to shove, we just blow the bolts, explosive bolts in the sense of NASA. We can separate off. That will convince them, if nothing else, to make a better deal with us. And you might think, well, gee, Paul, that's heresy, because we know that there's all of these publications that say that we can't have our own independent control. There's a bunch of governments that are getting ready to do it. When you hear about how China wants to have its own root system and Russia wants to have its own root system, those governments are getting ready to do this, so this idea may be out there. But what I would like to do is I'd like to see if what we can do is take a more consensus blockchain technology and use it to implement real consensus as opposed to the supposed consensus that we see from ICANN today. There's an issue about should delegations be permanent or not, or should we always have to rent your names? Now, with domain names, you have to rent your name unless, oddly enough, you're one of some of the old names that were under .us, where they were given permanent access many years ago. It's a little known fact. But they don't have to pay rent every year on their name. Very strange. I think from the standpoint of blockchain distributed ledger technology, the sacred cows there are all truth in a single blockchain. Can't do it. And people don't want to do it. If what I'm doing is I'm worried about quantum computing and the fact that maybe all this crypto will break, it's fine that I have a ledger that secured it and I like it. But it's probably not so fine that I necessarily make that data public to everybody. We heard before, I think it was McAfee was talking about, well, gee, if you have this currency and any government in the world can just run through the blockchain, and if they can do one transaction with you, they can figure out everything you own, that might not be where you want to be. So there's that issue. I think that the other reason why you don't want to do it that way is it was never really true. And the other thing is we don't have a scalable system if you do it that way. So scaling is another issue. So at CoinWeb, we're trying to work together with some of our partners to figure out how to solve this problem and how to make the keys that you can't remember and certainly are error-prone go away, and you get user-friendly names that can replace them, and you can create at will. So I can have as many as I want. I maybe want to have some that are anonymous and some not. We want to put it in a global directory, and we don't want to particularly own it. We want to be able to federate it with other parties so that we have the kind of ideal that you had from Satoshi. Better IDs is one of the things we need to do in order to get the 3 orders of magnitude of expansion. We can't get to the human population without having some way to do that. Thanks very much, and you've been a great audience. What can you do? Well, I think those are the 3 things I suggest you do. Keep innovating. Don't trust the experts, particularly when they tell you about sacred cows. And figure out how to get your own name and use it in this way. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Paul. I'll take this. And I will open up QA for the audience. Again, I will need the production assistant to help me on moving the microphone. Thank you. And who has the first question? Oh, yes. Oh, great, thank you. And can you state your name as well?
Christopher Scan. Thank you very much, Paul, for your presentation. I have just one question about your project. So you are using blockchain technology to distribute, you know, the management of the domain name server, DNS. So my question will be, which kind of blockchain are you using at the moment? Or are you developing your own blockchain system, or you are using your services on top of existing blockchain?
We develop all of the things on top of existing blockchain technology. We're using some Litecoin right now. You know, but I just want to stress that I think that it may be that what you want is something that operates more like the DNS of today, in order to act as sort of the cache of information so that you can go look up these names, and then the actual transaction goes over a blockchain. And it may also be that because you want to have control over your namespace and have the philosophy of that be more of the distributed nature of the blockchain. So it may be the management of the top level domain or the root analog or whatever is actually done by blockchain and published through the DNS. So I'm saying the DNS is actually sort of the publishing mechanism, and the ground truth is always kept in blockchain-like databases. But I think the other thing is you have to federate. You have to deal with the fact that you'll have multiple blockchains and probably multiple different types.
Just one last question, because you point out, you know, IETF, for example, and ICANN, that have the control of domain name server. Are you willing to work, for example, on standardization, like ISO, that are dealing with you know, blockchain and DLT system at the moment, to make standards with this organization? Or what is your point of view about standardization? Just my last question.
Well, like I said, I was chair of the IETF, so I believe it's an important activity. Once upon a time, I was at an ISO meeting when I was chair of the IETF. And at the time, they had advised me to stop doing this DNS thing because they had X500. And I said, you know, I respectfully declined. And I knew that I had won when they came along and they said, well, can we actually use internet mail and domain names to work on our ISO documents? And I said, well, yeah, you have my permission. Although they didn't need the permission, but they thought they did. The ISO people are controlled by the telcos and state departments, and they may not be as fast moving as you would like. So I don't want to make them into an enemy, but I'm not thinking they're likely to accelerate the process. Thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
State your name and company as well.
Giacomo Zucco, BHP Network. A question about the possible competition to your project. Can you briefly state your considerations about pros and cons of other efforts to get to a distributed name system? Like right now in the blockchain space, there is like the Blockstack experiment. There is Keybase doing one name, and also very historically Namecoin. One of the first clones of Bitcoin was created just in order to try to create a kind of DNS on top of Bitcoin. Do you have some things that you don't like about this project, or do you think that some of them could somehow be reused or built upon, or you think you really have to go from scratch in solving this problem?
Well, first of all, doing it from scratch is never going to be the approach that I favor, unless, you know, it's really a hard question. So I believe in reusing the technology. I think I had my one slide where I said, you know, real artists steal. So I'm willing to steal from, you know, the blockchain world. I'm willing to have parts of the DNS world replaced with it and vice versa. I think some of the existing naming system efforts in blockchain were around creating a new naming space that can be sold and monetized, as opposed to creating one that's global in scope. So when I say that I'd like to be able to be compatible with the DNS, because I know I already have 4 billion or so users that are there. I mean, having that critical mass of users, you know, is just so important. So I don't want to give that up. So I think that, you know, a blend of those things with a little bit of new technology and new deployment is what I'm after. But I'm willing to steal from any artist. Thanks. I think you had a question. Oh, we're done. Any other? There was, I think, a question down here.
Hi, Paul. My name is Sanya Hansen I'm the co-founder of GTech Global Education UK. The question is, your platform, what you're developing, is absolutely fantastic, and all the rest of that. You mentioned in your presentation about the multiple development between different countries and nations. The Chinese will come up with their own versions, and the Americans, the Europeans, and all the rest of them. What do you think are going to be the challenges ahead in terms of your project and in terms of research usability?
You know, we have a bunch of sort of scars on our back from the DNS world. So, for example, in the recent expansion of the top-level domains, we had a battle between France and New Zealand. You might say, well, what was that battle about? Well, it was about the .wine and .ban, French version of wine, top-level domain, because the French were basically saying that the appellation contrôlée laws must apply. And for those of you that don't know what those laws are, they're the laws that say that, for example, champagne can only be made in the Champagne region of France. Okay. So, you know, elsewhere it has to be sparkling wine or something like that. So they were basically arguing that no domain names could be registered that were in contravention of those laws. And you might say, well, why were they arguing that with New Zealand? And the reason for it is that there's 3 small countries that don't obey the appellation contrôlée laws: New Zealand, China, and the US. But the US and China said, let's have the French fight with the New Zealanders to look like they're being picked on. True story, okay? So, you know, there's issues about controlling the namespace. I mean, there's another example I can give you, which is Amazon. The company Amazon wants the top-level domain called Amazon. Okay, meanwhile, there's those people that say, well, wait a second, the Amazon River down in South America, it's our national treasure. And national treasure names, like you can't have a top-level domain called .Paris unless you're Paris, France, even though the people in Paris, Texas might be upset. I forget how many Parises there are around the world. But there are these rules that are in place that say, well, gee, you know, particular place names that are just hugely significant, no, you can't have them for commercial purposes. Amazon, the company, may win that fight. And the reason is that the Amazon River actually divides countries. So no one country owns it, so no one country supposedly, I mean, I can't make some of this stuff up, but you can ask the ICANN people to explain the details. But they, you know, they believe that they should control things and that they can make various rules. And, you know, and it's kind of funny because the governments that go to ICANN meetings, they believe that they should control ICANN. And so, you know, there's always politics over a lot of this stuff. I mean, one of my original objectives with the DNS is I wanted to be able to say that every person in the US should be able to have a domain name if they want it. And I certainly wouldn't object to anybody in the rest of the world that wanted one. It's just that the International Standards Organization had told me that I was kind of forbidden to, I would be arrested if I stepped outside the US. No, they didn't really say that, but they were not happy with me. So, you know, those politics are always going to be there. And I think that one of the things we need is some stable namespace for doing financial transactions that's not subject to, well, you've heard this line before, right? I don't know, we should have like, you know, a standard line and we just say we apply it again. We apply it again here for exchanges of value. I'm sorry, that's a long answer, but I hope I got to your question. Anybody else? I know I'm separating you guys from lunch.
As an announcement, so Anthony is not able to come. He's going to be speaking tomorrow, so I am letting Paul go rogue right now for as many questions as he'd like to take.
I would like to have your opinion about, self-sovereign identity, because here you are pointing out, the management control of domain name server, and you want to use blockchain technology, yes, to disrupt this control. So I respect that, but I think that you are fighting with governments or maybe a control organization of standardization. But sovereign identity have the same problem. So do you think that a project like you running on with self-sovereign identity could be solve the same issues?
Perhaps I guess what I'm trying to say is that I don't want to pick fights with all the governments of the world. When I worked for ICANN for a year, and we did a research report on some technology that might be interesting to the DNS and such systems in the future for ICANN. And one of the things we suggested was blockchain. That was 2013, so it's not like this is a new idea for me. But I'm not really interested in getting in fights, but I am interested in being able to have an escape hatch, so that if, for example, somebody says, well, no, we're going to be able to just delete these names and not have a stable base, I don't think that's a good direction to head. I may not be able to get what I call beachfront names, like .Paris or Monaco or whatever. Yeah, sure, fine, that's okay. It may be that it's a long string of characters. I think that the email addresses that we see today are small and user-friendly enough, and maybe I won't even get to be Paul. I'll have to be Paul 502, but there's some compromise that can be there. And for a lot of these financial transactions, they are handled by machines through interfaces, through APIs. So I think it's just being able to generate the names and the identifiers, and then being able to flexibly map them. Just like I don't remember most of the phone numbers, I just leave it on my iPhone. The mapping from the name that I use. So that's my objective. But these are all things that need to be worked on. I just think that there's some principles here that we need in order to try and grow this user base.
Hi, over here in the back.
All right.
Hi, my name is Anaya. I wanted to ask you, during the past months, all the WHOIS organization, ICANN, whatever, all these directories have been very affected by the GDPR privacy laws. So how do you think those kind of privacy laws that are so big and affect so many countries and territories could be affecting directories more like in a blockchain where it's not centralized?
Yeah, I think what you're referring to is the whole GDPR thing. And ICANN, when they created, for example, a lot of these new top-level domains, contractually required the people that were doing that to have the data available about who owns what domains, so that security people, for example, could use that information. I work for a couple of security companies, and they use that kind of information for researching who did what to whom, and they view it as a very valuable resource. A lot of government agencies use that same kind of resource. GDPR came along and said, well, no, you can't collect that data. Now, the thing that's interesting about it is that, and you certainly can't publish it if you do collect it. So the security people lost a valuable resource, although I'm sure they made a copy of the database whenever they could once they heard that GDPR was coming. And so they have it in some other jurisdiction so they can actually use it. And I'm sure that the US government, some of the agencies don't really care about whether or not they follow the GDPR rules. It's a loss for the people who do computer security to not be able to understand that. I guess it's a win for privacy. I mean, I generally like the idea of GDPR. You know, I lived in Europe for 8 years and thought that a more European attitude to restrict large companies and other people from collecting all the data in the world is a good thing. I think we won't know whether or not GDPR is a wonderful idea for a couple of years until we have a few test cases and so forth and see how it's actually enforced. One of the things that bothers me a little bit is, as far as I can tell, there's nobody you can ask whether or not a particular scheme is compliant, because the bodies that were supposed to be there to tell you whether or not this passed muster against the law, you know, haven't been operating yet. So I'm generally supportive of trying to limit the flow of information and being able to control your own information. But GDPR is, the jury's out, it's my view. The security industry has lost a valuable resource. And oh, by the way, the domain name registrars are saying, oh, gee, we don't have to give it out to competing domain name registrars anymore so that they can offer to do my account for less than my current provider. So they all piously go, oh, we're so sorry to like act against internet security, but our financial interest is aligned with it. So they're probably secretly happy.
Thank you, everybody. We are getting kicked out for lunch at this point. Thank you so much, Paul.